Well, welcome to a new episode of Trending Topics with BB. I believe, I took some time off. I've been trying another project of mine under BB Media Industries called the Love of Music Project on Twitch only. Actually, there's a way you can get recordings of the first couple episodes, but um, before I get to that, I wanted to welcome you back to the podcast. As you can tell, I'm in my ridiculous little studio here in my apartment, uh, recording this live. It is being recorded and beamed out on Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube. And also, this audio will be uploaded to the podcast feed uh, very soon. Probably actually after I complete recording this. Uh, so I wanted to do another news and updates episode of Trending Topics with BB. It's episode 149 because we have milestone episode 150 coming up, and then I also have a lineup for episode 151, literally the day after. Um, but I also want to kind of update you on just me. Uh, let's just be honest. Here's some real talk before I get into the nitty gritty. Basically, um, I've had an interesting year, 2021. Anybody else feel like this year is the shortest, longest year after the fact that 2020 was the shortest, longest year of our lives? Um, I've had an interesting year of just figuring stuff out here with the podcast, with everything under BB Media Industries, because I've been doing and creating content for so long now, and kind of, to be honest, hit a brick wall earlier this year. I've just kind of burnt out from it because I was reaching out to people to be guests. Some over the years, and some people have said, "Yeah, I'd love to be on the podcast." And then when it comes to scheduling, either they make up excuses, ghost me, or a combination of the two. And then I lose respect for you as a human being, to be honest, because it's like I don't see you being a guest on my podcast. There should be some sort of mutual respect. It shouldn't be like, oh, I'm doing you a favor, you're doing me a favor. Granted, I would say a lot of my guests that I've had on this podcast, specifically in the trance music dance world, specifically one of my very first early guests, Marcus Schultz, who I'm a huge fan of, that I've mentioned on the pod many times, um, was one of the few people that kept me going in this podcast because that was early on. That was episode 37. So it's been a journey on this podcast. But the point I'm trying to make is just like anything else, you got to respect people's time. Actually, funny story. One of my repeat guests on this podcast has started his own show on Instagram. He's a DJ, not specifically in dance music, um, but also has built he has a graphic design business, and he's also coaching DJs and building a culture. He has his own basically masterclass on becoming a DJ and propelling your own brand as a DJ and all of that and building the DJ culture. Anyway, point is he now has an Instagram live type podcast that he invites other DJs and he interviews them like I've interviewed him. And earlier this week, his monthly episode, his guests didn't show up. Um, and I tuned in because I was curious about this guest. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the origins of music and all of the influences and all that good stuff. And it seems to be a pattern of people not respecting people's time. Specifically people that are content creators like I am, like this DJ and other people out there. If people reach out to you to interview you and have a conversation here in a medium that is recorded, it's to learn more about you. It's to have a conversation. And that's why I've been doing this podcast for almost a decade. I'm not the biggest podcast in the world, obviously. We all know who that is. But I do it because I enjoy conversations, and I do it because I love learning from people in conversations. And just like anybody else who's a content creator who wants to go down this medium of interviewing people and having people on their own show, it also comes down to common courtesy, and you just respect people. If you don't really want to be a guest and you can't figure out his scheduling, and the scheduling is too hard, and there's just too many instances where basically it's not going to work out. Literally tell the host or the person that's reached out to you, "Hey, I can't make this happen. I'm sorry." Let them just be honest. None of this like ghosting and this whatever it may be. I know all of our lives are busy. We're all dealing with our own personal shit, but it just comes down to common courtesy. That way we can all move on. And I have respect for you. But for people to like, anyway, over the years in this podcast, I've reached out to people or people that early on were like, I'm going to be a big supporter and be a guest on your podcast. And now over the years, they've come up with excuses of why they don't want to be on this podcast, or that they're too big for me or whatever. I don't believe that anybody's too big for me. A part of what I do at BB Media Industries is I want to highlight the talented. So that doesn't mean that there's anybody that's I'm wanting to single out. It means that I'm trying to highlight people that maybe people you won't know of, or maybe it's super niche, like electronic dance music, and specifically trance as a subgenre of electronic dance music, or house music, or that you're not even aware. Like maybe you've learned something as a listener of this podcast or a watcher, wherever you're watching this podcast or paying attention from my guests. I've had people in the music industry. I've also had people who are scientists, people who are um, engineers, people that are comedians, people that are in other music genres such as a cappella. For those that know me, I've had guests from the group Straight No Chaser on here multiple times. They're good people. The point is common courtesy. It's like, as a content creator, it takes a lot to reach out to people. And when somebody, I'm not saying that they're lying. Maybe they have good intentions of saying, yes, I want to be a guest on the pod. But when they don't follow through, or at least say, oh, no, it's not going to work out, that's where the respect goes out the window. So, anyway, not to keep going on this tangent, I did want to update some news. You're seeing on the screen right now, the official website is trendingtopicswithbbpodcast.com. If you've listened to one or many of the episodes of this podcast or watched this podcast, I've urged you to check out the official website. That's where all of these episodes get posted. You also have links to basically everywhere this podcast is syndicated on the internet, as well as the merchandise. Now, the reason I keep bringing up the merchandise is because I feel like support content creators, support myself. I've had sponsors, not that I've really made any money from the sponsors that I've had on this podcast, but if you go and you support this podcast by ordering an item from the merch store, part of the proceeds come back to help this podcast. So not only you're supporting and spreading the word of the podcast by getting a t-shirt or buying some stickers or getting a iPhone case or a laptop holder or whatever item is available in the store, but you're also supporting this podcast because portion of those proceeds come back to help the podcast. That's why there is a merch store. And I know everybody has merch, but I mean, it is the holiday season and there is an early Black Friday sale going on right now. If you do, head over to trendingtopicswithbb.podcast.com and hit the merchandise tab. You'll be able to take advantage of the discount. So anyway, enough of the plug about that. Oh, so to go back, if you don't know, if you're a first time listener, welcome, or watcher, welcome. This podcast is one of the I also have another podcast called Sports Chat Podcast, but that was because I created a show back in the day called Sports Chat TV, which those episodes are still on YouTube. And then it went dormant for a while, and then I decided to, hey, I create a podcast out of it. Newsflash: I'm not as into sports as I was once. Music has really just taken over my life. I mean, it was always been music and sports, but basically, I've just music has really just saved my life in many, many ways. But I do still like sports. I mean, I'm a huge tennis fan. I've really in recent years got into Formula One. But when it comes to the professional team sports, I used to be huge into the NBA. It's just generational changes. I'm just not as into it because everybody I grew up with has retired or their coaches or what have you. It is what it is. And then I've recently decided to boycott the NFL. Not recently, but over the years, just because I don't agree with what's gone on in supporting certain things over the years. So, but the reason I'm bringing this up is that this podcast, Trending Topics with BB, and Sports Chat Podcast are part of a couple of the projects I have under BB Media Industries, which is a conglomeration of all these projects. I also have a podcast. I created a group of podcasts, including these podcasts, called the BB Podcast Network. I can't even speak. And it's just to help kind of market the podcasts. And if you head to bbmediaindustries.com, there's actually links to all of this, including Trending Topics with bbpodcast.com. But the point is despite me still figuring out how to make BB Media Industries be my sole way of moving in life, I am now just wanting just to keep going with the podcast. As much as I was getting on a rhythm of like, oh, you've noticed, I've been taking breaks this year just for mental health, which is a big topic on this podcast and should be to end the stigma. But anyway, so those are some updates. So if you check that out, I appreciate it. All right. So shout out to everybody who's watching. If you're watching on Twitch, if you're watching on Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, thank you. And those that will be listening to this afterwards, thank you. If you are want to go back and re-listen to this in podcast form, and you listen on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or anywhere that there usually is, you can leave a rating or a comment. It helps this podcast in the algorithm if there's more reviews. And I'll even take ones if you don't even like this podcast, but why are you listening? Anyway, but thank you to those that have left a favorable rating and comment it over the years. It's kept this podcast relevant. So the story of this podcast, for those that don't know, if you're new and you haven't binged any of the previous episodes, is that this actually started on YouTube, then went audio only for a while, and now is back to all mediums because, technology and times in content creation have changed. So hopefully you'll get a chance to go back and listen to previous episodes. Maybe you'll learn something from a lot of the guests. I've had wonderful guests that I've reached out to be on this podcast. Speaking of, as this is episode 149, Milestone 150 features a friend. He is well known for those of us that go on the Groove Cruise, which is the world's premier electronic dance music cruise. For those that love the music, he's a resident DJ on there. He goes by Trance Jesus, but I also know him as Chris Blackburn. Anyway, he will be on this podcast as a guest on the next episode coming up on December 4th, Saturday morning. It's 11 a.m. Central Time, 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, right here, same channels. So definitely, if you want to come back for that, he's also a Twitch streamer. So for those that are watching this on Twitch, head over to Trance Jesus, follow his channel. He just reached a huge follower milestone. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the preview that Groove Cruise is actually happening in January. I'm attending, so we're going to talk a little bit about that and just kind of his background. So hopefully you tune in. And then the following day, I have a couple of new guests, Julie and Jazz. They're fellow fans of the TV show SEAL Team that was on CBS that has now moved to Paramount Plus exclusively. I decided to binge watch this in recent months. I'm completely caught up. It's a very good show, and I wanted to talk about it on this podcast with some fellow fans. So tune in on Sunday, December 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. It's literally an hour before there usually is a watch party on Twitter with a lot of fans and the writers from SEAL Team, since every Sunday is when the new episodes get dropped for the season. So hopefully you check that out. So those are the two upcoming episodes after this one. So I'm excited for those and my guests and the topics. So great. Those are those. Got those on my list. So this episode was really not intended to be crazy long, as it is just news and updates. But I wanted to update you and kind of keep you abreast of what's happening on the podcast. This podcast is not going away. It just might have sporadic episodes. If you do check out the BB Media Industries Discord, or if you just go to bbmediaindustries.com, there's links to everything, but the Discord's on there. You can get access to the Love a Music Project Twitch streams. And the reason why it's kind of behind a few links and that's the way to do it is because in those episodes, I'm listening to music. And right now, with the way the music industry is, and I respect it, but also things are changing, is there's copyright laws with how you broadcast music and how things are available. And for that reason, I unlisted these episodes on the YouTube channel that some people may see this episode on. However, because of that, I don't want to disrespect the laws. So if you're interested in those, join the Discord, and that'll be a way to get those. And also, newsflash for those that don't know is that we switched hosting platforms for this podcast. After years of being loyal to Podbean, which there's nothing wrong with that, I actually have switched over to Anchor. And the good news is, Anchor has many different features, but you can support the podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast and help support this podcast on Anchor. So if you're, which is connected to Spotify. So if you're a loyal listener, you may have noticed that we've switched hosting platforms. So definitely check that out. And along those lines, because of that feature, this podcast is no longer on Patreon. I tried it again. And it's just not, I've been giving you free content for all these years. It would be lovely. But because I didn't start a Patreon 10 years ago when this podcast started, well, almost 10 years, it's just way too hard to try to get all of you lovely listeners to go over there. But if you do support this podcast, there's two ways you can do that. You can, like I said earlier, order your merchandise, or you can head over to the Anchor link if you find it on Anchor and hit the support button. That would mean the world to me as this podcast continues. All right. Well, I just wanted to check in here on this new episode. It's a short episode, but hopefully, I know I've had a viewer so on Twitch or whoever's listening or watching this. So, without further ado, I want you all to have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday if you celebrate, and rest of your weekend for those that, if you did notice, actually, check out the socials for today. I shouted out there's a trance music festival happening this weekend in Southern California called Dream State. A lot of people I do know are going. I'm not attending this one. I have in the past. But I wanted to shout out, there's a shout out to all of the episodes of this podcast that have featured people from that genre. So definitely check that out. Shout out to them. Thank you for being a guest on this podcast. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate everybody who got to this far and is supporting this podcast. And I look forward to the next few episodes that are coming up. So have a wonderful evening, morning, whenever you watch or listen to this podcast. And be safe, everybody.